And I think that that's what I want to do in my ministry. I want to have that flexibility and creativity and diversity. I want to speak Spanish. I
Hmm.
want to speak English. I want to be serious. I also want to be humorous. I want to be deep, but I want to be shallow. I just want it all, because I feel like the more diverse your ministry is, the more things you add to your ministry, the more you're capable of reaching a greater number.
Welcome to the Hacka Podcast. My name is Greg Hackathorn. I hope you all are doing well. I don't know about you, but I'm excited because today we are blessed to be joined by Loammi Diaz. Loammi Diaz is an international evangelist that has ministered all over the world. He ministers both in English and Spanish, and he has traveled across the world over these last 20 years or so as an evangelist all across America. He is a powerful preacher and gifted communicator of the gospel. If you've never heard him preach, I encourage you to find one of his many sermons on YouTube. You will really enjoy it and you will leave changed because of his ministry. I first met Loammi 10 years ago when he ministered at our Transfusion Youth Weekend, and we have been blessed to have him back multiple times over the years. I know you will enjoy this as much as I did, so let's get to the conversation. Welcome to the podcast. Thank you for joining me today, bro.
Man, it's a pleasure and an honor to be here and to be able to share and talk and discuss. I'm happy to be here.
I'm sure all of my listeners from the Sydney area are going to be really stoked to have you on here after having you for a number of years at the POS and get to know you a bit more. But I'm grateful that you availed yourself. You set time aside for this conversation tonight.
Absolutely. I've actually been to Australia. I think has it been like four times now, three, four times,
Um,
and
yeah, it's been 4 times. Yeah, you did our encounter conference twice, and then you did the youth. Oh no, you did encounter once, but you did transfusion and another
mhm,
our youth conference twice, and then you also came for Easter weekend when
right,
Pastor abandoned us. You
right.
came in and saved the day and did Easter for us.
Yeah, I think I have to say that my favorite experience out there was probably climbing the bridge. It was probably one of my favorite experiences. And the one thing that I've been wanting to do, and Pastor won't take me, but I said I want to go see a kangaroo in his natural habitat. I've never been able to see that.
Yeah, I lived in Australia for almost 2 years before I actually saw a live kangaroo in the wild. I'd seen heaps roadkill, but it took me nearly two full years before I actually saw one out and about. If you go to Canberra, you they'll drive you to a field and you can see dozens of them straight away.
Really?
Yeah, you're just in the wrong
That's where
spot.
I need to drive.
Yeah.
Well, what was interesting is um, I forget who I was with, but I told them about it, and they took me out to some random park, and they said they're usually around here somewhere. And I thought I thought to myself, "Are you serious? Like, is there I mean, it was just a random like cul-de-sac type place with a park. There was a park behind it, and they said they're usually around here. I don't know what's going on, and so I don't know.
And they weren't there.
But that's I want to do that. I will
uh,
definitely do
no, not to upset my friend Greg Wilmot, but we will not be bringing up LeBron James on this conversation, so we won't have a repeat of our drive down to Shell Harbor to watch the footy game. We had like a
that.
30-minute discussion, passionate discussion back and forth.
Absolutely. A lot more passionate than we were at church, unfortunately.
Oh man. Well, I wanted to get into talking to you a bit about your background. I like to start off these conversations with the guests giving us a bit of where they're coming from, the type of worldview that they present, and how they grew up. So if you wouldn't mind sharing with us a bit of you growing up and what that was like.
Sure. So it's a little complex because I've been everywhere. Um, so I was born in the Dominican Republic, out in the Caribbean island. So my first language is Spanish. I am full Dominican. I was also born a pastor's kid, and I was brought to the States when I was 5 years old. We got here on a religious visa,
Mm.
and yeah, and then we went through the process. We filed an application to stay. It took us a while, but we got our residency here, our green
Wow.
card, and then nationalized. So that was the process. Raised in New York from about 6 years old, well, maybe 6 years old, until I went over to Bible school in Stockton. So I have lived in the Dominican, New York, Stockton, California,
Mm-hmm.
back to New York, back to Stockton, then finished that off. Then got married, went back to New York, then from New York, lived in Hawaii for a year,
Mm.
waiting for the birth. It was a little less than a year. Waiting for that's where my son Caleb was born. Then came back to New York. Then from New York, went to Phoenix, lived there 10 years. And then from Phoenix, went to Pearland, Texas, which is basically Houston.
Mm-hmm.
And then now I'm in Indianapolis, Indiana. And more than likely, this is not permanent. So stay tuned.
Wow. And then on
That's
top
my background.
And then on top of all of that, you're a traveling evangelist. So you're living all these different spots, but you're also traveling out week after week.
Yep.
I think when I
Yep.
first, I think when I first met you, you were living in Phoenix. That's where you're at. Is that right? That would have been,
I would say so. Yeah. Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah. You're right. I was living
2011,
in
2012.
Phoenix.
So
I
you,
love Phoenix.
oh yeah, it's nice. Yeah, from what I've heard, people say it's quite similar to Sydney in the weather. Obviously, they don't have the beaches that we have, but
No.
is that accurate? You reckon?
Weather wise, is Sydney hot?
It is, but the problem is you tend to be coming out. I think you have come over either in autumn, is what they say here. They don't say fall, autumn or winter. Every time you've come, I don't think you have come in summer, which would be our December, January, February.
Oh, okay. Yeah. No. When I'm usually it's April. Um, yeah, I don't think I've ever been there that early, like
Mm.
December, January, or whatever. Does it get like really cold in Sydney?
I mean, you're in Indiana, so no, no. But like in comparative terms, but like we'll get down to around 0 centigrade, so 0 Celsius, which would be around 32, 35. That would be the
Oh, okay.
coldest it
That's
actually
below.
gets here.
Yeah, and that's below freezing point, right?
Very rarely will we get to -1, which would be below freezing. But typically, like this winter, the coldest it's been is maybe 2 or 3 degrees in the morning, and that's like early in the morning. It's never that cold throughout the day. Like your coldest day would be, you know, 11, 12, 13 degrees Celsius, which would be in the what 50s, I would guess. I think that's
Mm,
after
yeah,
all these years here.
that's
Yeah, yeah. After all these years here, I still haven't gotten good at translating Fahrenheit and Celsius. It's not straight up.
I gave up. Gave up. I was trying to translate. I was translating for a man, like he was preaching in English, and I was translating into Spanish. And it's here in the States, so I was trying to do Fahrenheit. when and he was doing Celsius. It just boggled my mind how horribly I failed at that. It was awful.
Yeah, it's always
And
a guess.
yeah. And so I finally said, you know what? Just you go research it. Ask Siri on your way home.
So you said that your parents pastored in New York. I believe was that the Bronx that you grew up in New York?
Yes, yes. I grew up in the Bronx, grew up in the South Bronx, rough, rough area. I grew up in the era where hip hop was born, or rap music was born in the streets.
Hmm.
Where when I grew up, that's when it was. It was born in the streets. So that was my that was our culture. Like shootouts everywhere,
Wow.
stabbings everywhere, drugs everywhere. But man, I made it.
Hmm.
Just today I was looking at some pictures from the Bronx, and I was a little shocked. I used to play ball, so I was a little shocked at how far I've come from those days. But yeah, it was a rough. Let me explain how crazy it was. It was so crazy that we as kids we would sit up on the roof of our building, maybe six floor building, and we would sit on the roof of our building on Saturdays and literally shoot Jehovah's Witnesses with BB guns from the sixth from the roof. So you shoot, hope to hit somebody, and then run. I mean, that was just normal shenanigans. I mean,
Hmm.
I can go on and on, but that's basically how we did it.
Wow.
Uh,
And your dad, did your dad actually pastor in the Bronx or just lived in the Bronx?
he pastored in the Bronx. So my dad pastored in the Bronx. Then we moved to Manhattan, started a church there,
Hmm.
and then we brought that church to the Bronx. So we transferred that church back to the Bronx. But and that church is still in operation, still going. But yeah, my dad pastored in the Bronx, so most of my childhood memories are from the Bronx.
Hmm. And you hinted at being pretty good at basketball. Did you do what was that like playing ball in that type of environment?
So I played organized ball, but my senior year. The reason why I grew up with an extremely conservative father,
Hmm.
did not allow sports or anything of that nature. It was very secular at the time, and so um, so the way it happened was my coach, he had seen me a couple times. He'd talked to me, but I was walking down the hallway one time, and he stopped me, and he said, "Hey, you have something I need," and on my team, and he was the basketball coach, and I thought to myself, "Oh my goodness, he's probably seen me play during recess, or he's watched me play at the court somewhere." So I was pretty excited about that. I was like, "Really? Yeah, okay." And then he goes, "And it's height." And that just burst my bubble. But anyway, a long story short, I went back home and I pleaded with my dad to let me play. To this day, he never gave me an answer. He didn't say
Mm.
yes, he didn't say no. But the fact that he didn't answer was my cue that I guess it would be okay. Uh, it would be okay, but he was uncomfortable with it.
Mm.
I guess he didn't want to say no. He didn't want to say yes, but he didn't want to say no for my sake. So a good compromise is he never came to any of my games. And this is hilarious. My family never came to any of my games. They went to one game because I asked them. It was an all-star game that we were playing against the likes of like Stephon Marbury. Who else was there? There was a guy named Felipe Lopez. He went into the league.
Mm-hmm.
There were some a couple of younger guys that were actually playing, but they were behind us. But they were playing. Was like a Lamar Odom,
Mm-hmm.
um, Ron Artest, or Meta World Peace. Now, the point is, it was stacked. I mean, like this tournament was stacked with players that actually made it, went to college, went to the NBA, and so I pleaded with my parents. It was my AAU team. I pleaded with my parents to go watch me because you know it was a huge deal, and I had nobody. Everyone's family was always in the stands and stuff, and I had no one. So I'd go to all these games all by myself. So this is the one game my whole family showed up. I mean, my whole family, well, my immediate family, my mother, my dad, my two sisters all showed up. And, they stuck out like a sore thumb because we're in Brooklyn. It's it was one of the most ghetto audiences that you could ever find, and they're going crazy. I mean, cussing up a storm, and you got these four live in a bubble, never seen sin in their lives, family sitting up in the stands, just looking around, scared out of their mind. But anyway, here is the craziest thing. I think I averaged my senior year. I averaged 18, I want to say 18 points or something like that, 17, 18 points maybe. Um, this one game, it's the only game ever I scored zero,
Oh no.
zero
Oh
points.
no.
And the one day now, I don't think my parents really get the game of basketball, or at the time anyway, so it didn't really. They were just proud of me, like, wow, you're playing something, like you're an athlete. But I was so embarrassed. The one time my parents came to see me, I scored zero points. I think we lost that game. I scored 0 points. Ironically, the next game I killed,
But
and
they
they
weren't
didn't
there.
show up. They weren't there, and I killed. And anyway,
You
so it is what it is.
put too much pressure on yourself.
Yeah, that's
Yeah.
probably what it was.
Yeah, I grew up in
Let's go
a
with that.
I grew up in a similar background. I was chuckling a bit when you said you had a strict dad who
Yeah.
wouldn't, that organized sports were secular. I didn't play any organized sports growing up, though I wanted to play all of them. And I think I did somewhat similar to you. 1 year in high school, I did cross country. So that was
Mm.
and wore tights underneath the shorts and all of that. So made sure
Yeah.
that it was
Yeah.
godly. But
Yeah.
yeah, yeah, back in the day, like that, being involved in organized sports was not really something you did. So you grew up in an environment like that as a pastor's son. At what point did you feel the call to ministry?
Honestly, I always want to say that it was when I was 10. That's when I want to say that I definitely felt like that's the direction I would take. But even before then, like I was sort of like a child prodigy. Like um, they would put me up on buckets out on the street corner and have me preach as early as like 8 years old. And I would preach and I would draw a huge crowd because, it's just an 8-year-old kid on a bucket preaching in the middle of the street or whatever. People
Right.
just loved it. They heard nothing I said, but they just loved the fact that I was a kid and I was preaching. So I think it was at 10 years old, I felt like, you know what? I think this is it for me. This is what I want to do. And I remember exactly where I was when I felt like this is really, really it.
Hmm.
Uh, well, and let me just say this. I've had several experiences like that. Well, I wouldn't say several, but at least two. The definite one was at 10. And then there was one that was even earlier than that,
Wow.
where I felt like, I'm gonna go this route. This is what I want to do. But I think the one where I felt like was the most definitive and the most personal for me, just on my knees, God and I, was at 10 years old at 1574 Beach Avenue. That was my apartment building,
Hmm.
apartment 4N. Don't know who lives there now, but that was it's where we lived, and
Wow.
that's where I got called. I
Wow.
feel.
So were you preaching quite young? You said you were preaching on the street. Were you preaching in the area as well and at your church when you were, say, a teenager?
Yeah, it wasn't as often, but so my first indoor message was at 10, and then I would preach maybe once or twice a year. I'd preach like once or twice a year after that. And then it wasn't until I was about 16ish, maybe 15, 16, maybe 16, that it started picking up. Like I preached at the church a couple times, and then I went and like different churches started asking me to come and speak at their youth events. Um, and so I started preaching youth services. And then I think I was 16 the first time I got asked to preach outside of like, it was either 16 or 17. It was the first time I was asked to preach outside of my district. It was in Lynn, Massachusetts, and I preached a revival. Actually, it was Boston, Massachusetts. It was a church from Lynn, but they were using a building in Boston. That's where I preached my first like revival. And just to give you an idea of how innocent and how pious I was at the time, the pastor came over and handed me an offering. And at the time I was 16, and this is a while back. And it was just a bunch of 20s in a envelope. And it was a pretty thick envelope with like 20s everywhere. That's all I remember. And I just remember I was so offended by that. Um, I was like, no way. I said, no. And he kept trying to, and I said, no, absolutely not. Thank you so much. But no, I cannot take that. And, it was foolish in a sense because there's a church that's trying to sow into your ministry
Right.
and here you are rejecting their gift to you, and it's unbiblical because a laborer is worth his hire, is worthy of
Mm.
his hire. But at the time, I didn't know Bible like that. It was just I admired the sentiment. I admired that I was in that place, that I was so pure, if you can say
Mm.
it like that. So untouched yet by um, vanity and the world at large. I guess that it was awful to me to even think of something like that. But yeah, that was in Boston, Massachusetts.
So did you start evangelizing while you're 16, 17, 18, or was that sort of like a one-off?
No, that was a one. And like I would go speak at places, but it wasn't like frequent like that or even
Right.
consistent. I would say I actually I went to plant a church when I was 19. So I got out of high school, went to secular college, and while I was at secular college, went and planted a church in New Jersey. And then from there, I went to Bible school. And while I was at Bible school, that's when I first got the idea of evangelizing. And the way it happened was very organic and very unexpected. It was just I was at Bible school. I wasn't looking for an invitation, wasn't looking for it. And a friend of mine just asked me to go, if I would speak for his dad. So I said, sure. So I went, I spoke at his dad's church, and I guess it went great. They weren't expecting that kind of ministry from someone in Bible school.
Mm-hmm.
So I, bro, word gets out, and I can't tell you how, but I guess that guy came back and word got out. Man, this dude can preach. I'm guessing that's
Mm-hmm.
probably the kind of word that got out. And so, all of those students represent a church somewhere.
Right.
So as word is starting to get out, especially in California, people are starting to call their pastors, or when they talk to their parents, they're like, man, you need to have this guy. I'm guessing that's the way it happened, because all of a sudden I start getting phone calls from people I didn't even know. Hey, come, can you preach here? There's a guy, oh, you would know him, Simeon
Mm-hmm.
Costa.
Yeah.
He called me up once and said, and I don't even think Simeon had ever heard me preach before, but I guess because that was the ongoing thing, or what people were saying, that this guy can preach. Simeon was slated to preach a revival at a church in Merced where Sam Emery preaches now, or pastors now,
Mm.
and he couldn't make it. And so he called me and he said, hey, bro, I got to go, but I can't go. But is there any way that you can make it tonight? So I did, bro. The rest is history. When I tell you, I think that was my first time preaching in English. I don't think I'd ever preached in English until I was 19, 20.
Oh, wow.
Um, well, I'll take that back. Like, the church that I started was English speaking in New Jersey,
Mm-hmm.
but it's really different when you're talking to three people,
Yeah.
basically.
You're teaching a Bible study or you're preaching a
Yeah, you're
revival.
talking to, I was talking to seven people, and like six of them were homeless. It's it's really, really different. Um, so man, I just remember going to Merced and preaching, and they had a pastor, Brother Yandris at the time, Nathan Yandris. This guy, I preached, it went really well, but I was in Bible school, bro. Like, I was a one trick pony. I had one message, and that was like the message. That was it. So he brought me back, and I went and I preached again. But the problem is, it wasn't as good the second or third time. But he kept bringing me back. And I had no idea why, because I remember feeling like, man, I just bombed. Like, that was the most awful thing you've ever heard. And he kept bringing me back, kept
Mm.
bringing me back. And honestly, that church right there probably put me through Bible school. I just kept preaching there. That's where I started getting I got my chance there, and Nathan Yandris never gave up on me. He
Mm.
kept bringing me back, kept loving me, kept telling me I was amazing, well, even when I knew I wasn't. But he kept bringing me back. And then there was another church that did the same too. It was in Santa Ana, California. And at the time, that was a pretty big church. And I would preach in their Spanish, and they didn't know that I really hadn't preached in English much. But they would also have me speak at their English service. And so I'd preach there. And same deal. He'd keep bringing me back. And bro, I'm telling you, I think that people don't realize sometimes that there are key people that God places in your life, especially at the beginning of your ministry,
Mm-hmm.
that just really believe in you and
Mm.
are willing to overlook some of the immaturity and mistakes and just keep giving you a chance. I almost equate it to, on a basketball team or on a sports team, but you see this on a basketball team, how there's a guy at the end of the bench, is not very, we would call him a scrub, but I don't know if that's a bad word or
That's all
not.
right.
So,
That's good.
all right. So there's a guy at the end of the bench, isn't good enough, but sometimes in, a coach just seems to like him, puts him in, has a certain affinity for him because maybe his defense or his energy or there's something about him that the coach likes, and the coach keeps bringing him in. But the more this coach brings him in and gives him that experience, the more this guy's developing in-game experience and the more he is honing his skills.
Mm.
And that's exactly what happened for me, at least in the English, in the English side of things. They kept bringing me back, and I would bomb. It was horrible, but they kept bringing me back. And finally, let me just say this: to this day, I don't feel like I'm an evangelist. I've never accepted that call.
Mm.
I've never felt like I was an evangelist. It's just that that's all I've been doing. I mean, I've tried to quit a million times. I've literally tried to quit a million times. Every year I say, okay, this is the year. What am I going to do? I'm going to corporate America. I'm going to do this. I'm going to be an investor. I'm going to start a business. I mean, I have a million ideas, because I've never felt this call to be an evangelist. As a matter of fact, sometimes I feel uncomfortable with the title of
Right.
evangelist because, first of all, because I don't do what true evangelists did in the Bible, or at least in the New Testament sense. So it
What
makes me a little uncomfortable.
What do you mean
Go
by
ahead.
that?
Well, an evangelist was, like, let's say, Philip. He would go into an area that was, unchurched, like Samaria,
Mm-hmm.
and he would go and evangelize. Basically, he was a messenger that was sent by God. He would bring the good gospel, and he would, start something, and then he'd leave it, and then other people would come and, grow the church and water it and bring structure. But basically, an evangelist was sort of, I guess, sort of like a church planner,
Mm-hmm.
if we could call that, more of like a church planner that
Like
would come in,
maybe like a
gather.
missionary.
Yeah, yeah, except that missionaries, for example, like Paul is more than an evangelist in the sense that missionaries would come into an area, they would start a church, but they would also start churches,
Mm.
and they would be, missionary is also, was in charge of churches under him and
Yeah.
stuff of that nature, just kind of running the region,
Right.
Whereas an evangelist was kind of like a one shot thing, just go in where the gospel is not reached, preach the gospel, gather people, and then go see an Ethiopian eunuch
Mm.
over in a desert somewhere. So he was just moving everywhere, wherever he was called. So, in a sense, I guess, the moving part, the transient part is kind of what I do, the itinerant ministry. Yeah. But, and I see why people call it an evangelist because of the itinerant aspect of it.
Mm-hmm.
But as far as like what really took place, I don't think I'm an evangelist in that sense. And because of that, I've never really connected with the title. I've never felt a call to it. I just do it because people keep calling.
Yeah.
I don't I don't call anyone. I don't have a business card. I don't have a website. I don't have product. I don't have books. I don't advertise. People just call and
Yeah.
my schedule just gets full. And so because of that, I just figure, well, the Lord hasn't really shut this door down.
Hmm.
So this must be a God thing.
Right.
And so I'm still here.
Yeah. And I don't mean this in any negative sense whatsoever, but I felt with your ministry, there's more depth to it than your classic evangelist, like your classic evangelist who comes in and tends to give like a different spin on the gospel, or talks about gift of faith and that sort of thing. But your ministry has a depth to it, even when you're traveling, which I mean, I've done a little bit of preaching out and that sort of stuff, and that's quite difficult to minister at a deeper level when you're coming into a church that you're not so familiar with.
Right. And I think, I feel like the reason for that is because I don't really have a conviction. I don't have conviction behind my evangelist call. And because of that, I am not going to force something that I'm not. I'm not a gatherer. I'm not I'm not a gatherer per se. I preach like a pastor. I
Mm,
preach like a teacher because who I've always, that's what I've always seen myself as. So I think that if you're going to call it a fivefold ministry, I think it's more like a fourfold ministry because pastor, teacher in the Greek seems to be the same office, pastor,
mm-hmm.
teacher. So I think it's more of a fourfold ministry. But if you were really going to identify me, I guess, in that fivefold ministry or fourfold ministry, I would probably be somewhere around pastor, teacher,
Mm,
maybe more teacher than pastor.
yeah.
But that's probably why my messages are a little more structured. There's, you know,
I just think also
you're,
like the concepts, the things that you deal with, tend to be on a deeper level as well. Like in your sermons, that's when I'm talking about depth. There's the theology there, obviously, and actually, I think this will lead us into our next question. But there's like the theology there, but there's also a spiritual depth to your ministry. I remember you preached an entire message about anxiety, and you don't
yeah,
hear that from evangelists. Like you would never hear a message like that from the
yeah,
typical evangelist, but powerful message and really impactful for those who are there.
right. But honestly, that's a very pastoral topic. Um,
Mm,
and I think that that's why, because I think a lot of pastors they bring me in to basically say the same thing they've been saying in a different way
mm,
or just a different perspective on what they've been saying to the church.
mm,
You know, I don't think any pastor really brings me in because they think this guy's going to bring all these unbelievers to it, and that's what I'm saying that I don't I've never claimed to have that calling, that ministry per se. But I think that pastors bring me in because they know this guy's going to minister to my church
mm.
and he's going to say what I've been saying, but he's going to say it differently. And
Right.
he's going to say it from a unique perspective. So that's what keeps me busy, I guess.
Well, this question here is for the preachers that listen to the podcast, and as you could probably already tell in this conversation, I love your preaching, your structure, the way you develop your sermons. You could tell that there is a lot of thought. There's a lot of effort that goes into development of your sermons, as well as the topics that you address. And this was a question I actually got from Pastor. I asked him, "Hey, I'm about to have Loammi Diaz on the podcast. Do you have any questions that you would ask him?" And he goes, "Yeah. How do you know what to preach?" And what we mean by that question is, how do you know what to preach, both in study and in execution, because you're preaching at different venues, preaching in different languages, all these different things. So what is your guiding light when it comes to how do you know what to preach in through your study, through your execution of the message?
So, okay, I'm a little different in a sense. I don't necessarily plan certain messages for certain events. I just when if it was up to me, my messages would be a lot more sequential
Mm-hmm.
and just going through the Bible. But obviously, I don't have a church where I could do that. Um, so I just kind of have to, you know, topics are open and you just kind of go, unless you're preaching at a conference and there's a theme. And so they ask you to preach on a certain subject.
Right.
But for me, this is very different than everybody else, I think. I don't plan to preach a certain message for a certain conference. And that's why I struggle when, for example, churches nowadays, they want your title and your texts and your scriptures 3 and 4 days in advance. And I'm like, man, like, bruh, there's times where I'm at the pulpit, literally at the pulpit, going, this is not it. And so I'm over here like, trying to buy some time.
Right.
So I'm like, hey, why don't y'all clap again? So people, so it's 2 minutes of clapping, and I'm still like, I'm not feeling this. This is not. That just happened to me this last weekend. I was at in Portland, and that just happened to me. So I get up, and first they tell me you're speaking in English, and they're going to translate for you into Spanish. It was a district men's conference, and so, man, I had a message. I thought I was, and then that didn't happen. Or I got in the car. I was ready to go to church, and the brother said, "Hey, listen, plans have changed. So now you're preaching one language." So I said, "Great." So I started looking while I was in service, just looking at the different subjects. Nothing was really standing out to me. Finally, I thought like, I could probably do this one. So I got up behind the pulpit and I'm giving my preliminaries. I've got my iPad open, and right when I was about to tell him to go search for a certain scripture, sure enough, this translator comes and stands right next to me and starts translating. So I look at him. I'm like, what's going on? I thought, but I couldn't say this, obviously. So I just said, I went, I'm going to have to, why don't you turn to your brother, two or three of them, maybe eight, and just go and hug them and tell them you love them. And, let's just fellowship for a little bit. So everyone's out there high-fiving each other or whatever. And I turn to him and I'm like, hey, bro, so are you supposed to translate? What's because I don't the message I've got really doesn't go well with translation. So anyway, long story short, we discussed it and stuff. And I said, hey, would it be okay if you go and sit next to I don't know who and just translate for them out there? Because there was only like two people that
That
needed
needed it,
translation.
yeah.
Yeah. So he was like, oh yeah, sure. So he got down. And then that changed that because when he told me that only two people needed translation, they only needed translation into English. So then that changed everything because now I'm like, well, then the majority here are Spanish.
Right.
So then the message I was going to preach was going to be English. So now I had to, so I switched that message 3 times in a period of like 10 minutes. And
Wow.
bro, it's a message I had not preached in forever. But I will say this, that's the benefit of having I do manuscripts, and a lot of people really condemn that, and they say, no, you should let the Holy Spirit guide you and just do an outline, a small little outline, write some verses, and just go up there and let the Holy Ghost guide you. I'm going to tell you that doesn't work. That doesn't work for me. The reason I do manuscripts is because this message is going to be preached. It may be, what's going to change is going to be my energy, the energy that I'm bringing out in the message, and the audience, how the audience is receiving it. But as far as the message, I mean, 90% of that message is going to be the same exact thing.
Mm.
And so I hadn't preached this message in years. I hadn't looked over the notes. I did not get to that service that day thinking I was going to preach it. But when all of this transpired, I said, this is it. This is it. This is gonna, bro. And I'm telling you, it was an amazing, amazing service. Amazing service. So I guess what I'm saying is I'm a little different in a sense, in the sense that when I prepare messages, like when I do sermon prep, and I try to do that 2, 3 times, well, probably more like 4 times, if you include when I travel on a plane and sometimes in a hotel when I'm at the hotel. So maybe 3 to 4 days out of the week is when I sermon prep. And I will typically, it would take me about 5 hours a day to sermon prep. And then I won't preach, hardly ever have I preached a message the very week that I sermon prep for it, because usually I need about 2 weeks of that. 2 full weeks, because once I've got the structure and the skeleton, now it's time to make it a sermon, which means put the stories and the data you've collected in the right places, find the humor here. Try to, I've already got all the basics down. So I've got the grammatical, historical, literary, geographical context, the immediate context. I've done all my studies, I've done all my stuff, and then even the collection of data. So I've gotten quotes and statistics and to corroborate my point. But now what's lacking is making it a sermon, because you're going to compile all of that, bring it, and it's a mess. Like, you've got all this stuff, all these points, this data, all this stuff, and you're going to try to make that a sermon. So I know I've taken a circuitous route to this answer, but I guess what I'm saying is twofold. Number one, how do I know that what to preach? I really don't until I'm in the service itself, and I get a feel for the crowd. When I get a feel, and this is, I think someone like, if you're like a reformed pastor, you're gonna cringe at what I'm saying, because they're a lot more structured in their sequence and stuff. But I just get a feel for the crowd, and I feel like, for me personally, you get a feel for the service, because sometimes, bro, the crowd's energy is there, and sometimes it's not.
Yeah.
And sometimes, if your energy isn't matching the crowd's energy, it's the word, and it's going to minister regardless. But what I'm saying is, sometimes you're not helping yourself with your delivery, and it's going to be the difference between whether you're laboring through it, or this is a smoother transition, or the smoother transaction. So that's how I do it. I get there, I get a feel for the crowd, I pray, I ask God, Lord, does this seem right? you know Obviously the Lord doesn't speak to me in audible voices or anything like that, but I just plead with him that the Holy Spirit will be with me, that he would help me through this, and then that I'm making that he's guiding me to select the correct message for the day. So That's my process.
No, it's fascinating, especially the study aspect that you spend that much time, and you can tell in the sermons that you deliver that there has been a lot of thought and a lot of effort put into the sermons. I remember one of my favorite ones from you. It was actually a teaching session. This is one that I remember quite well. I have a number of your sermons that I've enjoyed, but and I follow you on podcasts. You know, you preach at Tree of Life and a few other
Yeah.
churches, Pearland. But there was one. It was an anecdote, a story that you shared. You were talking about the importance of service, the importance of people, giving up their time and their energy and their effort to the kingdom. You're teaching about it, and you related it about this story where someone came up to you in the airport and was talking to you. Probably remember this, and was
Mm.
talking about how a sermon that you had preached had ministered to them when they were in a really tough spot, and you're thinking about, oh man, that's wow, amen. This is how you relate it in a way only you can, but you're talking about, oh man, yeah, that was awesome how it ministered to them, and then you went back through the process and of how that, I think it was a VHS or whatever it was, DVD,
Mhm, mhm,
ended up in
mhm.
the house. How you had to have a sound tech, you had to have someone on the camera, you had to have someone producing it, someone who manned the table to get the thing out, and the whole process that went into that happening. It was just really cool, very memorable story. But yeah, it
Absolutely.
and I think that that just is a testament to the thought that you put into your messages and your anecdotes.
I will say though, I will say this. Yes, and I appreciate your kind words because they help me. They help me in a sense that sometimes as an evangelist you preach and you feel like I don't know that people really know how much time and effort goes into preparing this or that.
Mm.
It's almost like that's with everything. I mean, like you go to the Olympics, people have prepared their whole life for a 2-minute routine,
Right.
and you see it and you're like, oh, okay, whatever, and you don't know the amount of years
Mm.
that people have placed and how much sacrifice and money and et cetera, et cetera. So that really helps me. It really encourages me. But I will say this: for that specific sermon, I cannot take credit for the amount of thought I put into that story because that story came to me. I'm not going to say luck because we don't believe in luck, but in God's providence, it came to me as I was preaching
Oh wow.
the very first time I preached that, and I preached that at it was a volunteers banquet type
Mm.
setting, and I remember I was speaking, and right as it got to the end, bam, that story came to me, and I told that story,
Wow.
and it was like amazing.
Mm.
And I thought, oh my goodness, how did that just happen? It just came to me. So then I just went back and I put it in my notes so that I never forget. And so I can't take credit for that one. It's in my thoughtfulness for that one. But yes, um,
uh,
to be frank with you, and I know this is not part of the questions and answers, but we're kind of on the subject. But to be frank with you, I feel like I get a lot more excited about a message when I have a powerful story, especially when it's something personal
mm.
story. When I find a personal story, when it comes to me, and I find a personal story to match with a certain sermon, that's when I really get excited because people will forget what you say, but people will never forget a story.
No.
I mean, 10 years, 20 years later, people will say, man, I remember you came to my church, bro. I don't remember the title. I don't really remember what you spoke about that day, but you said something about your dad and you said something about this and you said that. You remember that you, and I know exactly what message you're talking about because, that's the story. That's, so people remember a story.
Yeah,
Narratives are, and that's why Jesus used parables, basically, is so that people would remember.
yeah, they always minister powerfully, and I think that's also why people love podcasts so much, especially if you're diving into an individual story, because it's just you want to learn about that person, not just about what they have
Sure.
to say, but also about them as an individual. Um,
Sure.
Getting back to a little bit about evangelizing, I had a couple questions here before we start to wrap this up. But you've been preaching as a quote unquote evangelist for how long now?
Oh man. Um, I will say there's been a couple of years that I haven't done it per se, but a solid 20 something years, 24,
Wow.
25.
Yeah.
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, and just in the last say like month or so, I follow you on Instagram, and we've been messaging back and forth trying to set this up, and you get a bit of an idea of the sort of stuff that you deal with. I saw you translating for the bishop. Is that right?
Mm-hmm.
And then I think it was just we tried to set this up last week or 2 weeks ago, and you got an impromptu call to preach at a general conference in, was it in Mexico? Is that right?
Yes, 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 yes. I will probably say that has to be one of the most interesting, if not the most interesting conferences I've ever preached in my life. Because I'll tell you why. It's a circus. They call it a circus general conference.
Okay.
Okay. So what it is, well, I'll give you a little of the backstory. 30 years ago, there was a family that was a circus family, a family of like acrobats and so forth, that were, someone witnessed to them over in Mexico and they were saved. And they were still doing the whole, their whole routine and stuff. They got picked up by Ringling Brothers Barnum and Bailey Circus, which was performing 3 to 6 months into they were brand new, like babies in the Lord. And they were sent, they went on tour with them. And they were over at Madison Square Garden in New York City for 2 months. They stayed there for 2 months. So Daniel Scott called my father. Daniel Scott was a missionary and worked at headquarters and stuff. He called my father and said, "Hey, could you help us? This is a brand new family from Mexico. They are right now stationed in New York. They need help with discipleship. They need to be discipled. I mean, they know nothing." So my dad would go to the circus every single night. My dad would go and he would wait until the event was done, and it would be late, like really late at night. I remember him coming back in the wee hours of the morning every night. And he'd have to go to work, but this is like faithfully, this is what he would do. So he went out there and taught them doctrine, taught them about the Bible. It's basically they were getting a Bible school education that was being condensed into a month or two. So that's what my dad did for them. Well, fast forward 30 years to now. So what happened was they were having this conference. Let me explain what kind of conference it is. They went back to Mexico and started evangelizing their fellow circus, people, families, and stuff. And they've had a revival of circus families get converted
Wow.
in the last 5 to 10 years or so. And at this conference, there were over 37 circuses represented.
Oh my gosh.
37 of them.
Wow.
All right. So it's all circus families, their owners, everyone that's in the business of circus was there. Now they're all at different stages in their their maturity. But they're all baptized in Jesus' name. They're all, I mean, it's amazing. They had over 300 and something get the Holy Ghost
Wow.
uh, during the services. So they're, the circus people are bringing their friends and their families, and also workers that aren't converted, and owners and stuff. So they put up this big old circus tent, and they have all sorts of people, hundreds of people piled up in this thing. And it's the craziest deal, bro, because you're in service and all of a sudden there are people doing somersaults like off, where you're like, what? Okay, let me explain. So during service, everyone's at the altar, and then they had a couple of ushers come out, and they opened up the scenery, kind of like, so that there was a pathway from the pulpit all the way to the back of the tent, right? And so what they did was, now let me explain. This is like during the service. This is during worship. So they put a balloon. They they taped the balloon on the pulpit at the front of
Okay.
of the tent. And there was this guy that goes all the way to the back. He's a contortionist.
Yeah.
So this guy is all the way in the back. He's on his two hands, places his feet all the way up on top of his head, like from the back. He places his feet, so he's all the way contorted. They give him a bow and arrow, and with his feet, this guy shoots the balloon with his feet, shoots the balloon from all the way at the back of the tent.
Mid worship.
That's the during worship. That's the kind of stuff that was going on. So you didn't even know where to look. Like, there's a bunch of athletes and performers and stuff,
Oh
and
man.
they're really worshiping.
Mm.
They're really worshiping. But from time to time, like, you'd have someone just pop a somersault or do something where you're like, what is going on here?
Uh,
But bro, it was the most interesting deal, but you can't knock it unless you're there. Like,
mm.
the sincerity, the purity, the people who are just, they're new to the gospel, and they're just like embracing it. They're just
Mm.
loving it and bringing their friends and their family. And they may not understand all the ins and outs of holiness yet, but man, they're just excited about Jesus and
Mm.
excited about learning and doctrine, and they're so hungry. And so yeah, we had close to 400 receive the baptism of the Holy Ghost that night, or during the conference. It was just amazing. I would
That's
say
awesome.
that that's probably one of the most intriguing conferences of all time for me in the 20 something years that I've been doing this.
Yeah, I was gonna ask you for an interesting story, and I just mentioned that as an aside. That's amazing. That was just like
No,
2 weeks ago.
and honestly, I probably would have struggled. I have a lot of interesting stories, but I probably would have struggled with finding one. And so when you brought that up, I said, man, this is a story I've got to tell, because that's got to be
Yeah,
the
it's incredible.
craziest thing I've ever seen.
Yeah, and
But
then
it was amazing.
off the back of translating for the Eagles, so you're just going from strength to strength right now.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. It's my life right now.
I saw someone say that when you were translating for Brother Bernard, that it was like David and Goliath.
Someone said it was more like um, someone said it was like LeBron and Jerry West.
That's awesome. So you've
Yeah.
mentioned you're bilingual. Obviously, you grew up in a Spanish home. well, in a home where they spoke Spanish. You're not Spanish, but you're Dominican. But and you preach both in Spanish and English. So you're week to week you be ministering in Spanish conferences, English conferences, Spanish churches, English churches. What is something that the Western church, and by Western I mean like English speaking church, what can they learn from their Spanish speaking brothers and sisters that you've observed?
I think that hmm, I think with Hispanics, there's a lot more passion
Mm.
involved. Even their worship songs, there are some worship songs, bro, that blow my mind. The the level or the depth to the lyrics behind some of these songs. There's, for example, there's a line in one song, and it says, "There's no there's no greater place." I guess you have to get it more in Spanish, but it's just, to me, it's just so beautiful. The gist of the song is there is no greater place than to be at his feet.
Mm.
And when you mix the lyrics with the music it's just a beautiful song. And I think that I feel like, at least with me, whenever I speak in English, the English side of me gets more of my humor, probably gets more of um, my structure, I feel like I have to, my delivery has to be right. All of my studies have to be, lined up.
Mm-hmm.
But when I preach in Spanish, bro, I feel at ease because I know, well, most churches, not all churches, but most events, most churches, they're going to be right there with you. There's a hunger. They're there. They're preaching with you. They want to hear more. They're actively involved in the message. There's a kind of like a call and response. They're worshiping with you. They're preaching with you. They're reading. And there's a yeah, they're actively listening to what you're saying. Whereas I feel in the English realm, and this is not necessarily a bad thing, because we are commanded to be more critical and to be more like the Bereans, right? But I feel with the English side of things, it's more of that. It's more of a, let's be a little more critical of what's being said. Let's hear, let's and that's not necessarily a bad thing.
Mm.
But I feel like sometimes we can learn from the Hispanics, or Hispanics, in that there's a little more passion
Mm.
in what they do. And they really they love the Lord with all of their heart,
Mm.
and the heart being the seat of the emotions, and that's part of it. So, to me, a perfect balance of both would be an incredible setting, and you get that from time
Yeah.
to time.
Yeah.
But that to me would be great. So
Mm.
I think that's what we can learn: passion,
My wife,
hunger.
does music here, loves music, and I mean, she doesn't know hardly any Spanish. She knows like maybe 4 words, but she'll listen. She'll listen to songs in Spanish just because of the sound, and you can feel it. You can feel the
Absolutely,
passion for sure.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yep, absolutely.
I like to. This will be my final question before we get towards the end. I like to ask this to everyone who comes on. What drives you when it comes to ministry? What is your passion when it comes to your ministry?
Um, what drives me? Well, I think primarily what drives me is to glorify God in whatever I do. I want God to be glorified. Most of my sermons are very Christ centric, very God glorifying, or I hope they are, and that's what drives me, number one. And then I feel like another thing that drives me is my flexibility in my ministry. I want to be like a ministerial Gumby. if I don't, well, actually, I don't know if Australians know who Gumby was, but an elastic man, if I
Mm-hmm.
could say it that way, just kind of very flexible. I want to be able to reach everyone. And I think it drives me to, like, if you notice in my messages, something that I really work at actually is I want you to experience the whole gamut of emotions when I preach.
Mm-hmm.
I want you to, I want the church to go crazy and worship, and be dynamic, but I want you to think, but I want you to laugh,
Mm.
but I also want you to cry. And I want you to sit there and go, that really hit. Like that was deep, or that, I want to get it all from you. So you never know. I can be up here one time, I can be down here. You just never know where I'm going. But there's a method behind the madness. The reason I do that is because not everyone's going to be reached through theology. Not
Mm-hmm.
everyone's going to be reached. Now, you want to reach everyone with the gospel of Jesus Christ. But what I'm saying is, not everyone is going to respond to that gospel
Right.
through theology. Not everyone's going to respond through humor. Some are going to be there and go, oh man, that part where you cracked that joke about this and this, and that got me, and that's really what set them up
Mm-hmm.
to hear the rest of the
Right.
message.
Right.
And then some people are going to be there and they're going through a season or something that really is going to open up the floodgates for them, and they're going to weep because of something that was said, and that's going to be their part. And then some are there, they're like, man, you just gave me tools to answer a question that I had no answer for, biblically. Anyway, the point is, what drives me is I want to be as diverse as possible in my ministry, that to the Jew, I want to become a Jew. To the Greek, I want to become a Greek. But that um, by any means necessary, as Malcolm X said, but but that I may reach some. And I think that that's what I want to do in my ministry. I want to have that flexibility and creativity and diversity. I want to speak Spanish. I
Mm.
want to speak English. I want to be serious. I also want to be humorous. I want to be deep, but I want to be shallow. I just want it all.
Mm.
I want to be able to play music from time to time. I don't do that as much or at all anymore, but that's what I want to do. I want to do everything. I want to do everything, a little of everything, and just throw people off, because I feel like the more diverse your ministry is, the more things you add to your ministry, the more you're capable of reaching a greater number of people.
Mm. Yeah, that's a great answer.
So
Yeah.
yeah, that drives me.
Yeah, and you do feel that in your sermons that you're touching different, and in relationship with you in conversation, you'll be cracking up, but then you'll be serious, and um,
Yeah,
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 uh, yeah, it's plain to see that you're wanting to touch in all these different areas, especially when you're preaching. Well, I just want to
yeah.
thank you again for coming on and giving your time and talking to us today. I've thoroughly enjoyed this conversation and surprised at some of the places that I went, but I've really, really enjoyed it. And
Yeah.
I, I'd like to give you an opportunity as we finish up here to share a word with the listeners. It could be anything that you feel like God has laid on your heart for this podcast, for the listeners of this podcast. So, in closing, I'd like to give you that opportunity to share a word. Thank you, bro.
Absolutely. So even as we're recording this tonight, we've come to the realization that there is a suicide bomber over in Afghanistan at the airport there in Kabul. And I feel like what's happening in Afghanistan right now should be a wake up call to all of us, should be a wake up call to the church, especially in our first country or first world countries. You know, we need to force ourselves to read every single piece of news that comes from Afghanistan as it relates to persecuted Christians, even when it makes us uncomfortable, even when it turns our stomachs. And why is that? Because in first world countries, our Bible doesn't make real sense unless we see it through the lens of Afghanistanian Christians who are being persecuted. It really doesn't make too much sense. When we read passages of scripture, we see it through the lens of a 21st century first world, and we don't see it through the lens of the first century Middle Eastern culture in which Jesus found himself, and the apostles found themselves. You know, for example, we don't know what to do with verses like "You will be delivered up, even by your parents and brothers and relatives and friends, and some of you they will put to death." We don't know what to do with that. So many times we just spiritualize that, or we think, oh, that's for 2,000 years ago. It was probably like that. And we don't realize, man, there are people dying. Someone sent me a video today of Christians out in Afghanistan that are being gruesomely murdered for their beliefs. And the Lord said this for the church in Revelation. If you don't read it, if you don't read that text through the lens of what they were experiencing, you will never get it. It says, "Do not fret about what you're about to suffer. Behold, the devil is about to throw some of you in prison, that you may be tested. And for 10 days you will have tribulation, but be faithful unto death, and I will give you the crown of life." We don't read that through that lens. Like whenever I hear preachers preach that, I hear preachers emphasize the whole "you're going to get a crown of life," and you don't get the whole other part. The Lord was saying, hey, you're going to go to prison and you're going to be put to death. And absolutely, we need to pray. We need to pray for those, for God to deliver the Afghanistani Christians. We need to pray for God to work. But more than that, I feel like what we really need to pray for is for God to give them the courage to stand and to die for his name. That's what apostolic context is, you know. This gospel is not supposed to be preached in, oh, well, it's supposed to be preached throughout all the world. But if you look at where the apostles were sent, man, they were going, bro, these guys were going straight into hell to preach. And history tells us that all 12, with the exception of John, all died. They were martyrs. And this is just a far cry from what we're experiencing in today's day and time. And when the first church was persecuted in Acts chapter 4, what did they pray for? They did not pray to be delivered. They did not pray that God would give them influence with the kings. They said, now look at their threatening and grant us that we may preach the gospel with boldness. That's what they said. They asked for boldness. So I think we need to really force ourselves to watch the news, to read this, so that we may start getting an idea of what it truly means to carry the cross, to count the cost, to leave it all behind, to sacrifice it all. And that we may pray as well, Lord, give us the courage that when or if that ever shows up here in my nation, then I'm willing to stand for you, and I'm willing to get my head decapitated for your name's sake, for your glory and for my good. I feel like that's what we need more of in today's day and time.
What a powerful word to us today. I wanted to get this one out as quick as I could so that you could be blessed by it. We were only able to cover a bit of what I wanted to talk to him about, so hopefully we can get him back on the podcast another time. He has such an amazing story to tell. If this blessed you, please share it with a friend and encourage them to follow the podcast. We are on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, YouTube, and a number of other platforms. Just search the Hack a Podcast and you should find us. We are releasing content every week, and the best way to keep in touch is to subscribe or follow the podcast so it goes directly into your podcast feed. If you have time to rate and review the show where you listen to it, I would greatly appreciate that. Thank you again for your time today, and we look forward to seeing you next time on the Hack a Podcast.